And without further ado, I'm going to turn over to the CEO and founder of Luma, Terry Kawaja.
All right. Good morning. Come on up, guys. So we're going to have an interesting discussion about, geez, death and taxes. Can we get any more morose? Actually, it's, have a seat, guys. It's kind of appropriate, really, that we're here at the United Nations. It's a bit of a nod, you know, to tackling big issues like peace in the Middle East, after all. That's a lot easier than the ad tech supply chain. So it turns out that I have to do a little bit of a mea culpa here. Before we get into it with the panel, I may be partially responsible for this sort of focus on the sort of ad tech tax or what the intermediaries take out of the middle. I made a presentation back in May of 2010 where I talked about, you know, parsing the mayhem, where it actually was about a year after the Lumascape was first created, not yet called the Lumascape, but the first time it really sort of made its way to a lot of eyes. And I will note that we are talking about 7 years ago, almost to the day. And if you think about it, you know, that's a long time ago. We had stock market was only half of where it is today. If you know, Jason Derulo was topping the charts, and Luma was but just an idea. So that was a ways back, and I introduced the you know, what was then called the digital advertising technology landscape, which was more than a mouthful. And it, you know, it looks quaint now, right? Because it's only got about 150 logos on there. It's early days, and interestingly, like Rajiv pointed out this morning, I did want to make sure that we talked about the principles and not focus on the just on the intermediaries, and then figure out what the intermediaries were taking out of the equation. And so I made this comparison of, you know, what the advertiser pays and what the publisher gets under two models. At the time, the ad network model was the prevalent model in digital media, and it was very, very early days. You know, Google had not yet bought Invite Media, and so the whole programmatic space was just nascent. And I pointed out the significant inefficiencies of this model and how programmatic may change things. And quite frankly, these notions of what each of the components take out of it were just merely guesswork. It was just like, you know, something like this. And the net of it was it showed about a 40% sort of throughput of the supply chain. So yeah, maybe sort of I got to do a little bit of a mea culpa. So that was 7 years ago, and here we are today. And I think what I want to talk about is the issues around this sort of, you know, did I? Oh, right, yeah, of course, now today everyone's talking about the ad tech tax, and sure enough, you know, in and around the same sort of numbers, pointing to a sort of 60% being taken out from the middle. And I want to challenge that. I want to talk about that in comparison to other industries, and then I want to get into some of the issues. So for that, I've got the good fortune of having an expert group of folks to help me do that. So Eric Franchi, co-founder of Undertone, Dave Moore, chairman of Xaxis, Tyler Putterman from LiveRamp, he runs strategic partnerships, and Evan Simeone, head of product at PubMatic. I guess where I would like to start is, do we actually even have this wrong? Is framing this as a tax? It's, you know, it's so classic of ad tech to take common issues that are prevalent in any particular industry and blow them up and make them negative. It's no wonder there's so much negative sentiment about our sector. We do it to ourselves. Are we really talking about some wholly unique thing to digital advertising where there's value that gets taken out between one principle and the ultimate end principle, or are we just talking about a normal supply chain?
I think we have it all wrong. Or the premise of an ad tech tax and value being taken away, I think it's the opposite. I think if you think about everything that's been created, all the innovations, the ability to leverage things like programmatic to access like literally hundreds or thousands of new buyers, or the same buyers buying in a different way for a publisher, I think it's opportunity if you flip it around. I only know ad tech. This is the industry I grew up in and have worked in for a long time. But in preparation, I did some like Googling of like automotive supply chain, food supply chain, and ironically, every industry talks about this stuff. Ironically, there's issues with the automotive supply chain because it relates to lack of quality control with the recalls and everything like this. So I think at one point, I think we have it reversed on the other side. It's just the reality of doing business in a world economy.
I mean, if you think about it, digital advertising is the most complex media compared to television, magazine. I mean, local cable used to be the tough thing to buy. But today, digital marketing, advertising, very difficult, so complex, so many different things going on. And the question I always ask myself when I see a chart up like that where the publisher is getting 40 cents on the dollar is, what would they get if there were none of these intermediaries?
Right, yeah. Exactly.
And, as many of you may know, I was always on the sales side of the business, and once we were acquired by WPP, I became a little bit of both, buy side and sell side. And, as an advocate of the publisher for many, many years, I was always a proponent of getting the most amount of money that you possibly could for your properties, particularly given, other than for Google and Facebook, of course, but given the fact that it's so competitive out there, you need to pull out all the various weapons and technologies that'll help you get the largest share of money. And many times, you're better off getting 40% of something than 100% of nothing.
Exactly. Presumably, there's value creation along the way here. So you've got, on one hand, you've got DSPs that aggregate demand. You got, on the flip side, the supply side, you aggregate inventory. Tyler, your companies like LiveRamp are supplying critical data. I suppose the economics sort of dictate how much one particular intermediary is worth because, for example, Tyler, you could make media buys without the LiveRamp data, or you could do it with the LiveRamp data. You offer your data at a fixed price, and it turns out free, willing participants in the economic cycle choose to pay your price because clearly they must presume they're getting value creation for that.
Absolutely, and the same goes to, somebody might think they're getting fleeced by paying a 20% managed service fee, but is the alternative that you can't get skin in the game because you don't have the talent in-house, you don't have the bandwidth on your current team. It could be 20% or unrecoverable revenue. So I think it's each shop has a different story of which value, what value they're getting from each piece of the chain.
Yeah, so I see it the same way. So I don't see it as a tax because it's something, a tax is something you can't avoid. You have no choice in the matter and you don't necessarily directly get the benefit. It's a fee for a service which you can't avoid, right? Nobody needs to sell programmatically. You can sell everything directly. And the reason that people, especially started selling programmatically is because they weren't selling everything directly and there was stuff that was being unsold for which they were getting nothing. Now, I think what's happening is as programmatic moves more towards high-value brand advertising, and that percent becomes a percent of a higher CPM and portions of inventory that people are selling today, then they're taking a closer look at the supply chain and what they're paying for what. And I think it is important to know what you're getting for your money. I mean, there's certainly plenty of choices in the market too, right? So it's not like there's only one alternative for, a demand partner to monetize indirectly or to provide data. And yet, the prices are sort of close, right? Which I don't think there's a ton of extra slack in there that can just be sort of hand waved away.
Well, I think the premise, the negative narrative around this notion of a tax is that all these companies are venture backed, and they need that sort of take rate in order to produce profits to support the investments. When I think the reality is, obviously, people are willing participants are paying these prices. Dave, to your point, other media channels are at least more mature, whether they're more efficient or not, and perhaps less complex. I guess there's two elements here. One is the complexity, so there are more moving parts, although I might argue that television is going to come this way. I mean, television is going to be a lot more data informed, and there's going to be, Tyler's going to have a lot more contracts for TV buyers. We've already seen just announcements this week that TV is evolving towards a more data-informed buy, and when you do that, you're continuing to layer on complexity. Although I suppose another element to it relates to maturity or scale. TV buying takes place at a rate that's pretty consolidated and pretty high on average, and therefore the take rates look less. So might we see a day, as digital continues to grow in size, where we will logically see probably fewer players? That's the Luma answer to everything, is consolidate. But fewer players and greater volumes. And then can you warrant a business model, even with your venture backers, where you can do higher volume, lower take rate?
I mean, if you think about it, everything, of course, will go digital. So it's the comment you made on television, absolutely. It's going to be as complicated as digital marketing and advertising is today. But what I think will happen is that the bigger players will say, I want more than 40%, right? So I'm going to buy up some of those companies, or I'm going to develop the products that actually perform those roles in between myself and the advertiser, so I get to keep a bigger percentage of the money. I certainly would do that.
Well, I think the walled gardens do a pretty good job of tackling many of the functions across the Lumascape within at least media on their own properties.
Yeah, I think that makes sense. I mean, we did it at Undertone when we were noticing how much money we were spending on rich media, so to speak. And we might have viewed that as a tax on our business, because literally, like, everything had a rich media component. So we acquired a company. So from our perspective, we no longer pay the tax.
But even the walled gardens now are having companies muscle in to do measurement for them, because the days of measuring yourself are going away.
But that's a function of player coach, that it has to be having a air of independence compared to grading your own homework.
So one other thing that's going on, though, that I think relates to potentially a driver for consolidation is that the cost is going up for ad technology providers. So with header bidding and wrappers, the volume, the QPS, the number of impressions, which you're not necessarily going to monetize. You get no rev share out of potentially, because you see every impression. That's going up, and yet at the same time, there's pressure on margins and take rates. And unless you're a platform that's really invested in automation and can be very efficient and deliver great results even with higher volumes, then you're going to get squeezed out. And you're going to need to do something, right? Like,
I suppose there's always, this notion of free will, right? There's always the alternative. You can sell it directly. Maybe if we're going to talk about the ad tech tax, we should talk about credits. And by selling it programmatically, you get a credit for the direct salespeople that you don't need to hire because you're using that supply chain, or at least to sort of equate with it.
Yeah, I mean, direct sales aren't free either, right? So you're paying sales commissions, and you've got the overhead of the operational complexity of doing insertion orders, and you've got, of course, just the ad serving fees. Besides which, these days, a lot of direct IO business is using data as well, for which they're also paying. So it's not like that's free, right? And then there's some portion of inventory that's still not being sold directly, and then the question is the real question is how can you end up getting the most for that, and what is the combination of technologies and vendors in your supply chain that's going to deliver the most money, regardless. So if it were, for example, 90% gets taken, but that 10% you got was more than you would get any other way, then that's still to your advantage.
So in other words, market forces. So I do think this does become a bigger issue when things like header bidding democratize the availability through programmatic channels of even higher value inventory, and as Rajiv pointed out, more sort of brand-centric advertising comes to the fore through the programmatic channel. And I note that organizations like the ANA, who have talked a lot about the problems of the digital advertising supply chain, and I get when you want to pinpoint issues like measurement and fraud and viewability. Those are all valid concerns and challenges of the digital supply chain. But you also hear about the tax. You hear them talking about too much value evisceration coming from the middle. Are we conflating this issue, and is it dangerous to have marketers say less money for intermediaries for the sake of it?
They could certainly do that. It's kind of like the advertiser that was pissed off because his ads were in inappropriate YouTube content, so he cancels his search as well. And he's back in the day because sales started going down. So that would be a gut reaction that I think would be wrong. But the question really is, if you look at your Lumascape, and I guess you got about 12 different Lumascapes now?
18.
18 different Lumascapes with an average of how many companies on them?
Oh, well, there's 4,000 in total.
4,000. By the way, if you try to copy one of his Lumascapes, he's got fake companies on it. So you will be found out. But in any event, I just wonder how many of those companies that to me are almost products as compared to companies, how many of those will actually survive if they don't get bought by somebody on their own over time? And with the evolution of technology and, of course, artificial intelligence, which is now the biggest buzzword, I think, in the industry, along with perhaps virtual reality, how many of those companies will become obsolete where other technologies kind of encroach upon them and eventually eliminate them? I don't know the answer to that, but I would sell them as soon as you can.
There's the consolidation and collapsing of some of these accessory partners, but you also have to think about, can you be using your current tools in a more powerful way? Are you maxing them out? For example, cookies that are tied back to a persistent people-based identifier actually show less incidence of bot traffic. And it's because a bot can have a cookie. It's really easy for a bot to have a cookie, but it's less easy. It's possible, but it's less easy for a bot to have a cookie that's tied back to a people-based authenticator, such as an email. So generally, shops aren't adopting people-based identifiers for the exact target of decreasing fraud, but that's kind of a happy side effect that we've seen. So just think about the way you're using your tools. Are you really using them in every way possible, even beyond what they might be originally sold for?
Yeah, I think so to answer the question about the conversation with the marketers, we need to do a better job of explaining our industry. If they're talking about all of the intermediaries, all of the taxes that are in reality things that are adding value, things that are removing risk when it comes to things like brand safety, right? And helping with measurement. I think as an industry, we should do a better job. Part of it's your fault.
There we go.
2010. Start talking about taxes, it becomes legend. I'm kidding about that, but I think as an industry, we can do better. We can do better from an education perspective.
Frankly, advertisers really care all they want is a good supply chain, right? One that doesn't have fraud and privacy and some of these other things. But do they care that the publisher is getting 40 cents on the dollar? I don't think they do.
No.
All they care about is whether they're getting a return on investment. And if I'm spending $1 and I'm getting what I want out of that, what do I care how much publisher is getting?
Yeah, I think things have grown and evolved so quickly. And I understand how, everybody has their hands up in the air about taxes, because it was not too long ago that a publisher would sell directly to a marketer or an agency and make 100%, right? Now, all of a sudden, things have exploded, in our lifetimes and in our careers, to where everything is, all over the place, and there's lots of intermediaries. So I can understand where there's been a whipsaw effect, but we need to do better. If you look, if you Google like food supply chain, I was doing this last night, I was just looking at some stuff. There's a diagram of a banana, and the banana is sliced proportionate to ultimately how each piece has a fee associated to ultimately being delivered to the end consumer, right, the end buyer.
Yep.
The grower, the farmer receives something like 10%.
Yep.
Right? The grower who has the opportunity to sell to people in his local market, her local market, but then ultimately, if they work with Whole Foods, they get greater distribution, a far larger business. I think it's the point of what one of you was saying earlier. Is it 40% of a large number, or 10% of a large number, or 0% opportunity to sell to people across the country, across the globe?
Yeah, I
think
think
there's an analogy here.
I'm impressed. You actually prepared for this.
Other supply chains, whether physical or digital, can actually have much lower throughput than 40%.
Look at food.
Yep.
Food's tough. It's brutal for the actual producer.
And it is interesting, with if the ANA and Procter & Gamble are coming out saying we should have a digital advertising supply chain that only usurps 30%, now why don't you turn that around and say, okay, why don't you only make 30% on your Head and Shoulders and see what happens, right? I don't think, not here, not our supply chain.
Right.
So I do want to raise, though, some other alternatives, right? So Rajiv was mentioning that we'd started looking at software as a service licensing, or like CPM kind of licensing. So we don't offer it officially today. We don't have a list price for it, but we've started testing it. And so the interesting thing about that is if we're not based on a rev share, and instead are doing, a CPM or some kind of fixed cost, then essentially we're licensing technology, and then you have everything you need to, connect to demand, to serve ads, the whole thing. But it also changes the equation of the kind of services we provide in terms of driving demand and maximizing monetization. The automated algorithmic things, sure, that would be included in a technology fee, but we've also got a team of people going and talking to agencies and helping really to sell the media. So it's a question of if you want, as a publisher, technology, you could build it yourself and do all those integrations, but that's not to be underestimated, certainly. Or potentially you could rent it, right? But that's a different kind of relationship also. So you could pay less. It would be a lower fee, but it would also mean that you're taking more responsibility for the monetization as well.
And arguably, we have been way behind in terms of automating this process when you think about it. Here we're on the internet, all technology-based, and we're just, recently got into programmatic buying. So I think as more and more gets automated, that will also squeeze out some of those middlemen, and the publisher will actually get a larger return.
Well, I know it's self-serving, but this notion of, I think, we do have a highly fragmented ecosystem. That does not help, right? If you look at other industries and how they sort of grow, you have this sort of new company formation phase and then a consolidation phase where you end up with a growth of a sector, fewer players, all doing much, much larger volumes and at lower margins because they can. Amazon is the ultimate example of like zero margin, all the market share, kind of example. And, I'm not suggesting we should move towards that. We already have that a little bit with Google and Facebook. But the more the market matures, I think the easier that gets resolved. One of the fastest growing formats in media has been the performance model. Google in particular, or sorry, Facebook in particular, built a massive business, and AppLovin and AdColony and others with download performance models where it was a digital direct attribution, and it was like drinking from a fire hose. There was no campaign. They scaled massive revenues. Again, maybe not to that extreme, but does moving from a CPM to a CPA solve a lot of these issues where all you're really talking about is a bounty for whatever it is the marketer's looking to achieve?
I think so. Yeah, absolutely. If the marketer is paying what they want, all of a sudden, all of the concerns about taxes, theoretically go out the window.
As well as fraud.
Exactly.
Well,
right.
fraud doesn't matter, viewability doesn't matter, all those things go away.
It assumes, though, that it's a
baked into the cost of the
performance-oriented campaign as opposed to a brand campaign, right? Which is, and I think the rise of brand advertising and programmatic is one of the things that's driving this discussion. So it may not fully address that.
I think it'll help assuage it, but it wouldn't solve entirely because you might have great CPA, you might be hitting your goal, but you still then notice that you're next to some undesirable content and, back to square one.
And some people don't care about that.
I think all media is going to become performance media in terms of how it's measured by the marketer. It might not be CPA, but it's certainly going to be tied to, and this is why I think the Moat deal was so interesting, because it's connecting it to Datalogix, who is measuring, like in-store activity. I think ultimately everything is going to become measurable, and if it does, theoretically things get simplified.
But
a lot of this goes away.
Isn't it already there? It's just a question of the sophistication.
Right.
I mean, brand.
It's more measurable than any other media.
I mean, brand
There's work to be
campaigns
done.
are being measured.
Yeah.
Oh, she has a question over there.
She
Oh, no.
got-
Oh,
that's
that's
5
5 minutes. Oh, okay.
Keep going. Thank you, Jim.
I think it depends. People feel differently depending upon what they're paying for.
Yeah.
So data, people kind of get it, right? It's like a cost of goods sold. It's one of the ingredients into your targeted, ad answer. And so I think people are kind of like fine with that. Technology, interestingly, if you try and package it as technology, often the buyers don't have the budget for it. They're like, I need you to put this in the media because we just don't have, I can't justify this.
We've run into that. So, part of it has to do with who you're talking to. You're talking to somebody responsible for revenue. They want revenue. They're not doing technology planning. And we actually recently bounced this idea that of, platform as a service at a CPM rate. It would have saved a ton of money, but they weren't interested because they were only looking at revenue, not expense, right? So, it requires a discussion with somebody who's planning, a technology strategy, a platform strategy, as opposed to somebody who just owns a number.
Yeah.
But look at the other middleman that's come into the picture, which you know very well, and that's the DCO space, right? So all these DCO companies are not talking to licensing to the advertiser. They're either going to the publisher or they're going to the agency, and they're tacking a CPM onto a media buy.
Right.
And the advertisers are happy to pay it because the results are so much better when you have a variety of ads that are being tailored to, a certain group of people. So there's a great example of a new middleman that's, recently upon the scene that everybody's using because it works.
So final issue I want to address is the notion of transparency, because I think people, and maybe Eric pointed out something interesting here. Maybe the ANA's got it wrong. Maybe they're just not sophisticated enough. They don't understand it well enough. And so this notion of knowledge and transparency around how it actually works may be a good thing. What I find is people have issues when they don't know who's making the money. So whether it's the aggregation of inventory or the aggregation of demand, who's paying the fees, whether it's the publisher or the advertiser. And Dave, you in particular and your company has caught flack for this because your usual brethren have not taken the kind of business approach that you guys have to creating a media business. They've taken a pure agency approach that's just tacking on a percentage. You guys have gone about it a little differently. How have you navigated that?
Well, it's been difficult, and the ANA study certainly hasn't helped. And by the way, I completely agree with you, and I'd like to see you make a presentation at their next conference about their lack of knowledge of this. I'll be in the audience.
To be clear, it wasn't about lack of knowledge. It was about us needing to do a better job of educating
I'm
the
just
entire
being sarcastic. But it's hard. And if you go back to the example of taking one of Eric's examples, although I'll change it into a suit, because that's a very good-looking suit you have on.
I knew you were going to be here.
Imagine if you go into Brooks Brothers to buy a suit and you say to the guy, $300 for that? Was this made in China? Was it American? Was it brought over by boat or by plane? Who does the alterations? I'd like an itemized cost for that suit before I buy it. And I'll bet you if they do the itemized cost, it's $125. And they go, how can you possibly charge that? So that's one of the same things that I think is happening in the transparency business, right? Is that we're very transparent about not having a transparent business. And so you buy a package, we buy inventory, we package it up with media and technology and people, and it's one price. And it has to compete with everything else on your media plan. In fact, it even has to be better because a WPP client will say, well, of course you're buying Xaxis, you own it. And as long as we're performing, as long as they're getting their return on investment, I don't see what the problem is. What it is, though, is it's a religious issue, right? Procter & Gamble, Unilever, I'm not buying, I need to know.
Well, in life, and in particular in the advertising business, there's perception, there's reality. One matters the most, that's perception. And there is a perception that there is a tax, so perhaps one of the takeaways from this discussion is we do need to do a better job of informing them about the actual costs and the value that is created with all the intermediaries in the supply chain. I want to thank all my panelists. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Hey, hang on one second. Thank you very much. We actually have so much action going on Twitter on this one that we wanted to open it up to the room because some of you have been quite prolific in your comments. So we're going to give you an opportunity to get from behind the social wall and join the conversation here, because we want that to happen throughout the course of the day. You should feel free to interrupt the moderators and panelists. Everyone in this room could also be on the stage. So we want to give a moment to do that. By the way, the panel that comes behind this feels like it could continue this conversation.
Yeah.
They got some energy ready to go there with Randy leading that group. So if there are no questions, I'm not going to belabor it. I just saw a lot of activity on Twitter and we thought we'd open it to the room.
Well, who disagrees, right? I think there's a lot of consistency.
It's a fair question.
In terms of the POV of folks up here. Does anybody disagree? Does anybody believe that there's ad tech taxes and we really need to address it, or is everybody on the same page?
Is there a marketer in the room?
That will admit it?
At this point?
Amit Jamdadi from our customer success group is on his way over with a microphone. I am buying him half of another second of time, and he's there. No Olympic runner, but.
Hi, everyone. So I think the one question I had hearing
You gotta turn it on. There we go.
Is this on?
Yes, sir.
Hi, everyone. So the one question I had listening to you all speak is the part about, is the publisher getting enough of the money to deliver on the long-term quality content? I.e., it isn't just about what share they get in terms of the percentages, but what is the end dollar they get, and does that allow them to build a long-term business that can deliver to the advertiser's need? And that's an aspect of the question that fits into the cost of goods sold, which isn't always necessarily taken into account. So I was interested to hear.
Yeah, I actually think there's beyond just talking about this relative issue of is there fairness in terms of value provided versus the cost associated with all of the elements. You ultimately, all businesses are businesses. And so the advertiser has to figure out if what they're paying to promote their goods and services works for them and they can make money. The publishers have to figure out if the yield from their inventory can support their journalism, their content creation effort. That's another panel, right? And maybe there is another panel on that this afternoon. And quite frankly, the intermediaries in between, the data companies, have to figure out if what they're getting for selling their data works. You can look at Axciom stock price, done quite well. So perhaps the answer is yes. But so I think everyone, yes, does have to make sure that whatever business they're conducting, that it ultimately, supports their business models in the long run. I think there's been a lot of emphasis on this notion of, can publishers survive in this digital ecosystem, in particular with the usurpation from the duopolies of a lot of the ad spend.
Well,
but you're right.
Yeah, another example was just Procter & Gamble that moved from 5,000 websites to 2,000 websites?
JP Morgan,
Oh,
from
JP
400,000 sites to 5,000, which is still the long tail. If you
I mean, that's a lot of content out there.
Well, but 400,000 sites tells me, I mean, the long tail is really long. That's what I learned.
Yeah.